On June 15, 1904, a steamboat caught fire in the East River, and what happened next didn't just kill over 1,000 people, it fundamentally changed how New York City's poorest neighborhoods were built. The General Slocum wasn't a luxury liner. It was a workhorse, a charter boat that ferried working families on day trips. On that Wednesday morning, the St. Mark's Lutheran Church had rented the whole vessel for their annual outing. About 300 passengers boarded, German immigrants, their wives, their children. Most lived packed into the tenements of the Lower East Side. This was their escape, a few hours on the water. A break from rooms where 8 people shared what you'd call a closet today. But here's the thing, the boat's safety equipment hadn't been inspected in years. The lifeboats were rotting. The fire hoses, they didn't work. The captain didn't know his own crew well enough to trust them in a crisis. Nobody was thinking about what could go wrong because nobody was forced to. Regulation in 1904 was a suggestion, not a law. Around 10 a.m., a fire started in the hold. Maybe a discarded cigarette, maybe a lantern. No one knows for certain. What we know is that within minutes, the entire ship was engulfed. Passengers panicked. They rushed to the railings, but the lifeboats couldn't be lowered. Some jumped into the river. Others were trapped below deck. The water temperature was in the 60s, cold enough that many couldn't swim long enough to reach help. By the time tugboats reached the scene, over 1,000 people were dead. Most were women and children from that German community. It was the worst maritime disaster in New York City's history, and it happened on a clear, sunny day, just minutes from shore, in one of the busiest waterways in America. But here's where the story shifts from tragedy to economics. The disaster happened in a neighborhood already suffocating under a housing crisis. The Lower East Side, where most victims lived, was packed to breaking. Tenements, these were 5- or 6-story buildings that housed 20, 30, sometimes 40 families in a single structure. Rooms had no windows, hallways were dark, sanitation was medieval. Why? Because landlords made money by maximizing occupancy, not by maintaining standards. A family paid maybe $10 a month for a 2-room apartment. That's roughly $330 in today's money. For a landlord with 30 such units, that's $300 a month, or $600 a year in revenue from a building that cost almost nothing to maintain. The economics were brutal. Profit came from density, not safety. The Slocum disaster killed the people living in those tenements. And it killed something else, the pretense that the system was acceptable. Suddenly, journalists, reformers, and politicians couldn't ignore what had always been true, that poor New Yorkers were living in conditions that made them vulnerable to catastrophe. The St. Mark's Lutheran Church lost 61 members that day. The entire German immigrant community on the Lower East Side was traumatized. Survivors moved away. The neighborhood changed. But more importantly, the disaster created political pressure that had been building for years but finally couldn't be ignored anymore. Within a few years, New York began enforcing stricter building codes. Tenement laws tightened. Requirements for windows, fire escapes, ventilation, things that sound basic now but were radical then, became mandatory. Landlords had to spend money on safety equipment instead of pocketing every dollar. Their profit margins shrank. Rents didn't spike because supply and demand stayed balanced, but the economics of the tenement business fundamentally shifted. This is how housing gets reformed, usually not through ideology or good intentions, but through catastrophe. A fire kills enough people that ignoring the problem becomes politically impossible. A building collapses. A neighborhood becomes uninhabitable. The cost of regulation suddenly looks cheaper than the cost of the disaster. The General Slocum disaster reshaped the Lower East Side not because it was unique. Fires happened regularly in tenements, but because it was visible. The victims were on a boat full of families, not scattered across dozens of buildings. The death toll was impossible to ignore. The photographs, the names, the community's grief, all of it forced New York to confront a housing crisis it had been comfortable ignoring. After 1904, the tenements of the Lower East Side didn't disappear. They still exist today, but they became regulated. Fire escapes became standard. Hallways had to have windows. Overcrowding limits were enforced. The invisible poor, living in invisible buildings, suddenly had legal protections because one day they became visible and they died in public. So when you ask why a disaster that killed over 1,000 people in 1904 mattered to housing policy, the answer is this. It proved that the economics of the tenement business, where profit came from packing people into unsafe spaces, could be disrupted by law. Landlords adapted. They made money differently. And the poorest New Yorkers got a slightly safer place to live, not because anyone cared about them, but because they couldn't be ignored anymore. The Slocum disaster didn't solve housing poverty. It didn't end tenements. It didn't make the Lower East Side wealthy or even comfortable. But it changed the rules of how those spaces could be used. And in a city where housing is always about money, sometimes the only way to change the game is through loss so visible that the system can't absorb it. That's the answer to our original question. How did one catastrophe reshape a city's neighborhoods? Not through sentiment, but through economics. When the cost of regulation became cheaper than the cost of inaction, the system moved. The General Slocum burned on June 15, 1904. By 1910, New York's housing code looked completely different. Tragedy didn't fix poverty, but it fixed the rules. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into how cities change and what it costs when they don't. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.